Hey, what's up guys? My name is Cherno. Welcome back to my Game Engine series, and in fact, welcome back to the second day of Game Engine series week. This entire week I'm live streaming pretty much all day, every day on twitch.tv/thecherno. We're developing this Game Engine series. I'm putting a lot of time into it because I feel like we need to just get some work done and get ahead of the game because, we've been trailing along with all of these UI changes for a while, and I want to actually get to the point where we can make a game with Hazel. So that's what's happening this week. Definitely catch the stream if you can. And today specifically, we're going to be continuing on with the UI stuff, but adding some more UI so that we can actually basically build up scenes. It's quite an exciting episode because we'll be making some UI so that we can create new entities, add new components, remove components, and that way we can basically construct a scene. If we had like a blank scene in the Hazelnut editor, we'd be able to add some entities, like chuck on some components, and actually build something from scratch, which is pretty exciting. Last time we basically spent a lot of time making the transform component look nice, so check out the previous episode if you haven't already. And without further ado, let's jump into it. We'll have a quick look at the roadmap as well, because that's kind of dictating what we're doing. So over here on hazelengine.com/roadmap, there'll be a link in the description below if you're watching this on YouTube. We have this kind of Game Engine series progression, and we're currently doing Hazelnut UI MVP. We're basically finishing everything up. Last episode, as I mentioned, transform component UI is what we did, and today we're going to be doing these two things. So add remove entity UI and add remove component UI so that we can actually add remove components and entities from our scene. And then we'll move on to kind of just polishing our UI, making everything look really nice, adding like a different font so we're not using the default GUI font, all of that stuff next episode. Okay, cool. So without further ado, let's dive in and take a look at where we're at and what we'll be doing. So as I mentioned in the previous episode as well, because this is Game Engine Series Week, I'm working out how to do all of this stuff during the live stream, and I've already got a little patch that I've prepared that I'll basically be copying from. So all of the stuff that goes into this episode has already been written by me, so more or less I should know what I'm doing. And I'm just going to basically type it out and then explain it, and then hopefully that way it will serve as a nice little educational resource for you guys. So basically, if we think about adding and removing entities, let's do that first. So adding and removing entities, how's that supposed to work? Well, I like the idea of right-clicking inside this scene hierarchy and then being able to create like an empty entity. In the future, when we have certain primitives like cubes, cones, spheres, whatever, it'd be nice to be able to right click and create like a new sphere or something. And that would essentially just be like a empty entity with a transform component, with like a sphere component, with like a mesh component or something like that has like a default mesh or something on it. That's more or less what will probably happen. But at the moment, like I don't really, I don't want to create like every possible variant of entity. So like, for example, add new sprite entity or something like that. So I'll just make it so that if we right click, there'll be a little create empty entity button that we can press, and then that will actually just add an empty entity into the scene, and then you'll be able to select it, go down into the properties and add and remove certain components. I mean, you won't be able to remove like the transform component, which is what it comes with, but you'll be able to like add a camera component or add a sprite renderer component if you wanted to control the behavior of that specific entity. And then with deleting entities as well, it should be pretty simple. Just right click on the entity and then select delete entity. So that's the first step of what we'll be able to do. So if we take a look at the actual functionality before we take a look at the UI, we do have a create entity function, pretty simple, which is great because we can just call that. And obviously from the scene hierarchy panel, we have a context, which is our actual scene. So it's really easy for us to manipulate our scene by adding a new entity. What we don't have is something called remove entity, which I'll call destroy entity. I'll zoom in for all of you small text haters. Destroy entity will basically take in an entity and it will do exactly what it says it will do. It will just remove it from the registry. So we can just do registry destroy entity. Now entity at the moment, we can't really just pass it in because obviously destroy wants a entity, which is actually just a uint kind of ID. So we could obviously add a function that's just like, get, ent ID or get entity ID or whatever. But instead of doing that, what I'm going to do is over here inside our entity class, I'm going to add another one of these kind of implicit conversion operators. It's going to be an entity like that, right? And it's just going to return entity handle. So this basically lets us treat this entity class as an entity handle, because realistically that's what it is. I mean, yes, it's also a scene, but it is more or less like an entity is an entity, right? So they should be the same thing. There's an easy kind of implicit conversion, and that allows us to simply pass in our entity class whenever we have a function that takes in the entity, right? The entity. So that's really convenient from like a programming point of view, and you can see it looks really clean here, which I obviously like as well. And I mean, I wouldn't abuse this for all classes, but obviously, again, this is our version of entity. There should be a direct translation to this, because realistically, this entity class is just an abstraction. It's just a layer on top of this, right? With some additional information like the context, but you know, mostly it's just the same as this. So it makes sense. Okay, that's basically all we need here, right? Really, really simple. As I mentioned, now let's go and create some of the IMGUI UI that we need to actually be able to add and remove entities. So the first thing I'll start with is just the creation code. So if we go into the scene hierarchy panel, which we do here, we've got two panels here actually. We've got the scene hierarchy, and then we've got the properties as well. Maybe I'll split this up into functions so that it's less kind of ambiguous, but that's just the way that it currently is. So what I want to do is, maybe before we end, to create a right-click pop-up menu in IMGUI, very easy. We just type in IMGUI begin pop-up context window, right? So this means that, and we'll have to pass in some parameters. So string ID we can keep as 0, which is the default. Pop-up flags as well, we're not interested in that. What we do need is this third parameter though, which is over items. Basically this, as far as I'm aware, if we set this to false, it won't trigger this right-click menu if you're on an item, and an item being an entity in this case. So we have to click on a blank space, because if we click on an existing entity, we obviously want the entity to handle that, right? As in, we might want to change the context menu that pops up to like delete the entity instead of add a new entity. It doesn't make sense for us to do that. Maybe in the future, like even if we do add, like I'm just thinking about, maybe you might want to right click on an existing entity and then add an entity, still have add entity in that context menu so that you can maybe add it as a child entity. But regardless, it's still a different context menu, because you can't like delete an entity if you click on a blank space. But when you click on an entity, you might want to delete it. So they do still have to be different. So this is explicitly the menu for if you right click on a blank space. So I will specifically write that in. So we'll add a menu item here, create empty entity, and then basically all we want to do is go to our context, which is our scene, and create an entity. Now I'll just call it empty entity. In fact, I'll get rid of this because it's pretty simple, and then we can just do IMGUI and pop up. That's it. That's as simple as it is. As this grows, we can add separators, we can add more menu items, we can add, you know, menu items with child items as well, so that we can have like another list, and you know, we can just grow this. But for now, obviously, create empty entity is all we need. That's it. I'm not even going to test that just yet, because that was no code at all. What I'm going to do though is go down to where we actually render each entity, which is draw entity node. And what I want to do here is basically, let's see, we've got opened, is item clicked. What I want to do is over here, I want to begin the same thing as we did here, except instead of being a window, it's going to be an item, begin pop-up context item. And this is going to let us delete the entity. So let me just find where I did this over here. I think I called it delete entity. So what we'll do is, this will be begin pop-up context item. This is going to be specifically for this tree node EX item. And then we're going to have a menu item here called delete entity. And again, this is just going to do mcontext destroy entity. That's it. Really, really simple stuff. Now, hold your horses. You might think that this will work, but it's a little bit dodgy. The reason is that it's possible that when we open this, we still want to do certain other things, right? So once this has been opened, potentially, if we destroy the entity here, what it means is that the rest of this code is not going to work anymore, right? Now, in this case, I think it still will because we're not doing anything too dramatic. I mean, we are still using the tag component. This actually might be a good idea, right? So check this out. If this is opened, right, we're rendering the, as a tree node EX, we're rendering, we've got this like specific tag that we're rendering here, right? This is like an open on arrow thing. We're drawing an entity node in the, in the scene hierarchy. If it's present, essentially, we're going to be rendering. Actually, no, this is only if it's open. So this might not be the best example because this is the main one. And this is if like we're rendering children, but this still stands, right? So if we're rendering child nodes, the kind of sequence of events here is that we basically delete the entire entity here. And then down here, we try and access the tag from the entity that we've destroyed here. So hopefully that makes sense as to why that's an issue. Because if we try and run this code and we try and access this tag, it's not going to be present anymore. We've destroyed it. It's gone. So because of that, we actually need to defer the destruction of this particular entity. We can't just destroy an entity immediately, because if we did that, we'd basically have to like return from the function. That might not be a good thing to do because obviously, we have like certain other IAMGUI closing code that we may need to run. We don't really want to do that. We still want to continue rendering this frame, but just basically mark the entity for deletion so that when we finished this frame, we can then delete it. So next frame, it's not even going to draw this entity node because there won't be an entity. So hopefully that makes sense. So to defer that, we'll just, we can just like write a little boolean here called entity deleted, set it to false, right? And then set entity deleted to true here, finish everything, and then at the very end of the function, basically, if the entity was deleted, we delete it. So hopefully that kind of like, deferring the deletion of the entity makes sense, because if we just delete it immediately, that could break certain other things that might rely on that entity being there. So we just want to mark it for deletion, finish the rest of our UI rendering, and then delete it at the end. So that's what this code will do. So if we run this now, hopefully what should happen is we should be able to just create and delete entities. And hopefully that'll just be the same as creating an empty entity with just a transform component through our C++ code, which is what we have been doing so far. So this green square, let's select the red square, actually right click and then delete. Ooh, we have an error, that's good. Let's check it out. Has component, tag component, and this happens for draw components. Okay. So where does draw components get called from? Selection context. Okay, that's the other thing we actually need to do if we delete an entity. That entity was currently selected, and our properties panel is supposed to obviously display the properties for the currently selected entity. Now this selection context, which is the current entity that we've selected and then deleted, doesn't exist anymore, right? So we can't retrieve any properties from this selection context because this entity has been deleted. So what we need to do is basically clear the selection context. So if we come over here, and I'm glad this came up because I forgot to copy down that bit of code. But this way I think it makes a little bit more sense. So if the entity was deleted, not only do we destroy the entity, but if the selection context, we can do a little check here. If the selection context is actually the entity that we've just deleted, right? Then we can actually clear the selection context. So we don't really want to touch it if it's not even selected, obviously. We don't want to like have another entity selected and then we delete something else and it clears our selection context. But if it is this entity, then we do have to clear it because otherwise we're not going to be able to retrieve any of the other things from there. Okay, cool. So right click on the red square, delete entity, there you go, it's gone. We should also be able to create an empty entity if we right click somewhere here, and obviously if we right click on an existing entity, it will get deleted. So create empty entity, there it is, we have an empty entity, we can call it something else. Didn't we have the WASD only work if it was focused? Why is that just working now? Oh, that's part of the script, sorry, not the camera, never mind. That's expected for now. Okay, so there's something else, and then we can delete something else, and we can delete the green square. Anyway, point is everything works and looks good. So now what I want to be able to do is add components, right? So it's good that we can add entities and stuff like that, but we also need to be able to create components and remove components. Now again, like some of the UI here, you could spend quite a while on. So I don't really want to spend too much time on that, but let's first of all add the add component functionality. So we are focusing on functionality. We'll focus on polish in the next episode when we get there. So when we draw these components, if we have a selection context, this is our properties panel. I'm just going to create a button underneath all of our components. So we've drawn all of our components. Now we're kind of underneath. I'm just going to create a button that's going to be called add component. Whoops, button add component. And what this is going to do is actually open a pop-up menu. So this is kind of like opening a context menu for right-click, but this is actually, we press a button to open it. And this is going to be, now we have to provide it with a string ID. It doesn't matter what this is, just make sure that it's like a unique identifier. And then we can begin the pop-up. So basically what this will do is, and we use that ID again. So basically what this will do is if we click on the button, it will open this pop-up, which will then basically render the pop-up, right, until it's closed. And this pop-up will contain a list of buttons, essentially. You could probably, I'm not sure if menu items would work here. I guess they would work here. Maybe we should try menu items. I don't know. I wrote buttons, but let's just see what a menu item looks like. Because yeah, we'll just decide what looks better, I guess. So let's just say camera, right? So if we click on this, we should be adding a camera component to the selection context. So add component, camera components, and then we'll close. Is there an end menu item? I don't think so. No, there shouldn't be. But we do have to close the pop-up because obviously we don't want to leave that pop-up menu open once we've actually added a component. So that's the camera, and then we'll do the same thing for the sprite renderer. So I'm calling it sprite renderer, and that's going to add the sprite renderer component to the current selection context and then end the pop-up. That's it. Really, really simple. Nothing to it, really. Now, you can probably notice that, first of all, we are going to have a lot of components in the future, and this code is fairly like simple, right? I mean, really the only variables here are the string, which is the name, and then the actual like component. So we could easily, you know, bring this out into like a templated function, or even have some kind of component registry so that we can iterate over every component inside Hazel, like in a for loop or something, and then draw them here. That might be useful for like more of a plugin system, because if someone adds their own custom component, we obviously want it to show up here. And if there's no registry, then there's no way to really do that without modifying this code. So we'll talk about maybe making that a little bit more flexible in the future, but for now, we will leave it as is. So you can see with this add component button. So let's try this out. Let's create a new empty entity. I'll make a pink square. I'll call it pink square. I'll add the component sprite renderer, and then you can see we've got a white square now. We can change it to pink, and then obviously move it out of the way because it's in front of the red square. There you go, right? And then I can scale it up, do whatever I want with it, and that's obviously a new entity that I've added. Now I can right click and hit delete, and that works as well. Now finally, I want to be able to remove a component. So how do I do this? Well, the way, basically what me and the stream came up with is kind of similar to what Unity has. It's got like a little triple dot system going on the right of the header for the component. So as I try desperately to find this code, draw components, what I want to do basically, and not every component is removable, like this one is, sorry, this one isn't, transform component, we don't want to be able to remove that, but camera component is obviously removable. How do we do that? Well, let's take a look at that. So first of all, we need to adjust our tree node flags a little bit, and obviously all of the tree nodes here are going to have the same flags. So I'm actually going to just bring this out here and just write const imgui tree node flags equals that for now. There's a few other things that I want. I want it, and this is more of like a, we won't do any styling stuff just yet. We'll do imgui tree node flags allow item overlap though, because I think that that's going to be required for what we're about to do. And then I'll replace all of the tree node EXs should now have tree node flags. So that's going in here. Tree node flags. All right, cool. So now what we'll do is, the reason I did this is because I'm actually going to add a button that's on the same kind of line, I guess, as the actual header for this kind of tree node dropdown, which is our kind of component header. So the way that we're going to do that is we need to basically change this so that we render it separately, because in between these two, we need to render our button. And if I just do I'm GUI same line, and then I'll throw in our button, which I'll just make a plus sign at this point because it'll show our extra stuff. Then over here, I'm going to open a pop-up called component settings. And this component settings, again, this is just an ID. It's not a label that will be rendered. We'll open like component settings. We will, where should we begin that pop-up? I guess we can probably begin it immediately. So we'll just do if I'm GUI begin pop-up component settings and pop-up. So this is going to contain our menu item for removing a component. So I'm GUI remove component. I'm GUI menu item remove component. Again, it's going to set remove component to true. So we're deferring removing this. And that's all it's going to do. And then a little bit later on, once we render all this stuff, because obviously this relies on the current component. This is for the transform components. This was probably a bad place to do it. We'll move it in a minute. But if remove component is true, then we basically just do entity remove component. And that's it. And in this case, it's the transform component. But we obviously can't remove the transform, but you get the point. It's just this, right? So what we're going to do is take this this whole I'm GUI same line, this button code. We're going to take it and let's make our sprite renderer component the one that we're going to experiment on. So this obviously we need to bring out into here like that. And then we'll do same line, we'll have the button, and then we'll do this here. The reason is I want to tweak this code and make it good first, and then we'll copy paste it everywhere else. Now, as I say the words copy and paste, you might be thinking, why is there so much copying and pasting? There shouldn't be, right? We're going to refactor all of these components out into a function so that all of the stuff that is common across every component stays that way, so that we don't have to like copy and paste this code all the time, because obviously it's a bit of a drag and it's going to lead to some bugs potentially in the future, or at the very least, possible inconsistencies. Okay, so now that we have this, right, it's going to look terrible, but it should work, and that's kind of the goal. Okay, so we should be able to, so we have this little plus sign, you can see it does look terrible, next to sprite render, and we'll talk about improving it a little bit actually in this episode. But we should be able to remove the sprite renderer. So for the red square, we can right click on this, oh sorry, not right click, just click on this, and then remove component. You can see it's gone, and we now no longer have our red square. Same with green square, let's remove that component, it's gone, okay? Really simple stuff. Now, how can we make this look a little bit better? We're not gonna spend too much time on that today, because I do want to improve the styling in the next episode. But basically, what I'm going to do is, and what I did during the live streams was, instead of this kind of, instead of aligning this to the left, I want to align it to the right. So what I'll do is I'll get the current window width, and you can just type this into it as a parameter into the same line, into the same line function. We'll subtract 25. And then I'll actually make the button have a particular size. So I think 20 by 20 is what we had it as. Okay, and whoops, this is obviously something that goes into here. Okay, so that should look quite a bit better. Oh, and the final thing was, before we even open this thing, I also pushed it, and this is more of like a stylish thing, I guess. A style thing, but basically I set the frame padding to be 4:4, which just kind of made it look a little bit better, and then we can pop it after, I guess, the button. So we're going a little bit into the next episode with this kind of styles and styling everything, but I think that it will look a little bit nicer now, which could be nice, okay? So there we go, we've got sprite renderer, it appears on this side. This is still looking a bit thin. Again, it won't, because we'll play around with it and make it look a bit better. but you should be able to see now that we have the button on the right side over here. We'll also make it so that these things have a frame in the next episode, but ultimately you can click here and click on remove component and it works, okay? So in summary, let's test this out because we should be able to now basically create a blank scene and just build up our current scene just using what we've got here. So let's delete everything. I'll delete all the cameras. Oh, and this brings me back to a little camera bug that we have, but we'll deal with that in a minute. So if I create an empty entity, let's just make this our camera. I won't add the camera component yet. I'll make another empty entity. This will be our square. I'll add a sprite renderer component to our square and make it pink. And then obviously we need to add the camera so we see something. You can see that, well, we don't see anything, right? We should. Until we resize and then we suddenly see it. The reason is that if you notice what happens with the camera, when we have a scene camera, we have a function called recalculate projection that is based on the viewport size. So we basically need to set the viewport size. If we don't do this, then it doesn't work. Now, I think that the reason this worked before was because set viewport size runs on viewport resize, right? So on viewport, flying around. On viewport resize inside the scene class, go away. On viewport resize inside the scene class, you can see tries to get all of the camera components and actually runs the set viewport size function on all of them. Now on viewport resize is called on the very first frame because we check out this frame buffer specification, we know the viewport size is not set at the moment, we get the current size and then we call viewport resize. So because this happens on the first frame of our actual rendering, it works like for when we start the application because obviously we set up the camera before the first frame. That doesn't work anymore. So what we actually need to do here, and there's a few solutions to this, but ultimately when we add a camera component, we probably want to trigger a resize. Now, we don't want to trigger a resize over all of the cameras in the scene, but just that specific camera that we've now added, we need to basically make sure that it adheres to the current viewport if that's what it wants, if it's not rendering like off screen to something else potentially. So how do we do that? Well, we can't do that from within the camera class because we need the viewport size. And where is the viewport size? Technically, it's inside the scene class, right? We have viewport width and height. So the scene class has to be aware of a camera component being added. Now, Ent actually has a mechanism set up for this. What you can do is you can do something like registry, on construct, and then so if we construct a camera component, we can do .connect and then add an actual function. Like you can put a little like function into here. It's not going to be a member function or anything like that. This complicates things a little bit because it's fine if you just want to interact with the registry itself, but if you want to interact with the context, which is a scene, you need some kind of like global way potentially of getting a list of scenes, which we will technically have in the future because we'll need that, but we don't want to have it at this stage. So what I kind of did instead is basically I added a new function to the entity class. And this isn't really in the entity class, but it's more so what happens is when you add a component, what it will actually do is, so we'll have our component that we add here, is there'll be a callback into the scene to handle a particular event that might happen if we actually add that component. So essentially what this will be is mscene on component added t, right? So this means that we've added a component to the scene and specifically to a particular entity, which of course is, well, just this in this case, right? And then that way we can handle it. Now we could also pass the component along. That's something that we could do if we really wanted to. That way we wouldn't need to retrieve it from the entity. So we've added this component to the entity. I guess I'll probably leave it like that. I didn't do that during the live stream, but I will here. And then what we'll do is this will be a private function inside the scene class. We are friends with the scene. So if you look at this, we are friend class entity here, which means that we can access all the private members. And then I'm going to add a template type name t. That will be the component, obviously. Void on component added entity, and then the component. Now, I'm not going to implement this here, right? I'm going to use a little bit of a trick that not many people know about, but basically what I want to do is create a bunch of template specializations for this that are inside the CPP file. The reason is I don't want to implement all of them in the header file. It's going to make it really messy. What I'm going to do instead, and I'm not 100% sure if this is in the C++ standard or if it works across all compilers, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm going to do is take this template and implement it inside the CPP file. So this default template will just static assert, right? Because you're never supposed to not have a specialization for it. And then what I'll do, and sorry, this will be scene on component added. And then what I'm going to do is write a template specialization here. So void scene on component added. So this will be like, for example, for the transform component. Entity transform component, and that will do something. Now the transform component doesn't need to do anything, so we'll leave it blank unless we want to obviously do something in the future, but we basically have to have one of these for each component, because if we don't, then when we try and add it to the entity, it's not going to work, because it's going to try and call on component added, and it's basically going to give us a linking error because there's no overload for it, and since we've implemented the template in the C++ file, it needs to be present. So that's kind of my little solution for now. The only reason why I'm slightly concerned about this is because it really might not work for when we have custom components and stuff like that. But you know, there are other ways around it. Like at the moment, we are relying on templates, but we could definitely have some kind of, you know, we know what component we're adding, so we could have like a get component ID function on each component maybe, and then that could, like, you know, do scene on component added without a template, right? Because it's got the actual ID of whatever class, you know, we're trying to add, and maybe every component needs to have like a get ID function. I don't know. There's so many ways you could kind of do this, but for now we'll just do it this way, especially because we don't have many components. I might revisit this next time. So this though will do the right thing. It'll just do component, which is a camera component, dot camera dot set viewport size, and guess what? We can just use viewport width and viewport height. So now we're setting those correctly, and that's all we need to do, but we also need one of these for every other component. So sprite renderer, tag, and native script component is what I've got here. Sprite renderer component, tag component, probably should do this in order. And then native script component. Okay, that's done. That should work. And now we have a way to handle all these components being added, which is kind of nice as well. Let's try and run that. That should work. If we get any linking errors, it's probably because we've forgotten a specialization, but I think we should be okay. Okay, so now if I do what I did last time, so I'll delete everything, including the cameras. I'll create my pink square, add component sprite renderer. Let's make it pink for fun. And then I'll create a new empty entity, which will be our camera, and I should just be able to do add component camera, and you can see our pink square immediately. Okay, that's how that works. Now, obviously, like you probably wouldn't even need to do this in the future, because this is kind of, even though this is like the editor view, it's actually kind of like the runtime at the moment, right? So this camera entity is obviously supposed to be used in the runtime. When we actually like run the game, this camera is what renders. When we're not running the game, we should have some kind of editor camera that's, you know, present regardless of whether or not we actually have a camera entity in our scene or not. So that's not really like correct, I guess, but obviously for now we are actually mandating you to have a camera inside your scene if you want to see something, so that's how that works. Hopefully all of this made sense. Next episode we're going to spend some time making everything look a whole lot prettier, and I'm really looking forward to doing that. We'll add a new font and stuff like that, and just generally make everything look good and spend some time on that. Thank you all for watching. Don't forget you can help support the series by going to patreon.com/thecherno, where you get access to previous live streams, as well as like the Hazel dev code, which is way more advanced than this. I will see you guys next time. Goodbye.